Bonsoir. À l'exception
Good evening.
de quelques puissances mal intentionnées
Some powers
s'accordent à
have
diagnostiquer
ill
l'urgence
intentions,
menace la survie de
but
l'humanité.
all the other ones analyze the situation
N'ont pas l'ampleur nécessaire.
as very negative. So what can we do at the individual's level, the villages, the regions, our countries? What policy can we have in order to protect the climate and our planet? What are the objectives we can set? What are the means to reach them? What is the time frame? These are a few questions we will ask our three guests tonight in the framework of this seminar organized by the Urban School of Lyon. So we have invited Holly Jean Bach. She works at the University of Buffalo, and she wrote a book about geoengineering. Yasmina Burger, she is mayor of the first district of the city of Lyon. And Marc Alizard, who is a philosopher, he's published many different essays, in particular the last one published a few days ago called the Coup d'État Climatique. Our debate will be translated into English, so it will force us to take our time in order to be properly interpreted. And first of all, I would like to listen to some students who have organized this week, in the framework of the School of Anthropocene, a seminar about ecological emergency and action. So I want to give the floor to Irène and Damien. I thank them to give us this feedback. It will be somehow difficult maybe for them because maybe they're not used to speaking in media. Damien, you study ethics, ecology and sustainable development, as well as your friend. Thanks a lot. So with Damien, we have organized a workshop, ecological time and time for ecological emergency and time for action. For us, not only was interesting speaking about climate emergency, we all agree on this, but also to think over the time for action, because this ecological emergency is something that puts everybody in agreement. In other words, we have to act. And what is the time frame? The global one. But when we study philosophy, it seems important for us to think over this time frame, because this framework is not neutral. We can relate to events, to historical events, in different ways. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, time was seen as an arrow, and action was always happening at present with future objectives. With François Hartog, who is a specialist in history and philosophy, after the world wars and the end of the Eastern Bloc, we entered a new historical regime, and present is not organized according to future objectives. We still want to keep the present alive, and that influences the way of designing action, because action would be the way to find practical and technical solutions in order to go on existing as we do today. And this has happened for 20 years. And we want to challenge this framework because Anthropocene is the name of a historic era, and today mankind have become a major geological force. And we have to rethink the time scale, not as a unique one, but as a diverse one. Today, the Anthropocene issue is an issue about time, a way of organizing, a way of acting in order to respect the use we make of natural resources, taking into account this temporality. Thank you for this introduction. I suppose we'll comment on time with our guests. So I'll follow up your reflection with multiple times, also according to the different players. Damien, thank you for this introduction. So in order to moderate this participative workshop, we organized podcasts after interviewing researchers of different fields. I will introduce them to you. The first one that we can see on the screen was made with Dominique Bourg about political and psychological obstacles. Then we could speak with Vera Raffenso, a philosopher, who has insisted on the imprevisibility and instability of our time, connecting time showing that weather and time have common points. We interviewed also the philosopher of sciences, Bernadette Bensaud-Vincent. We could make 3 podcasts. The first one with the metaphor of the time arrow. We've already spoken about this image. And the second podcast was about catastrophism. When we speak about the end of time, what do we mean? And the last one about redesigning time. Then we had a geographical interview with Michel Lusseau, who analyzed spatio-temporal aspects of the urban Anthropocene. Then we had more of a political approach with Théophile Bénigot, a political philosopher who spoke about democracy and put in perspective the system faced with this ecological emergency, because climate change is not on the same temporal scale, time scale, as democracy. Then we spoke with Isabelle Michelet, who wanted to have an interview on the law for future generations, connected with the definition of sustainable development, and then Anthropocene and climatology with Valérie Masson-Delmotte. And I would like to highlight what I'm saying, in particular with 2 podcasts, the interview of Bernadette Bensaud-Vincent, the redesigning time, and Benjamin Pradel, studying time in the urban sociology and the making of the city. The first one being the approach of another metaphor of time, time being seen as a landscape, timescape, where you think of multiple dimensions, local, plural stories that we can face with a global history. It's not a projection in the future, but a current action aiming at developing possibilities now. Benjamin Pradel speaks about time, analyzing it through sociology, as Henri Lefebvre did in the 60s, 70s, and he uses this theory in order to understand society. And he speaks about four relationships with time. Time on the longer term allows us to demystify urban spaces that are commonly seen as intangible. Secondly, counter time, different temporalities, allowing us to live with nature or another form of life. Thirdly, cycles in the urban making. And fourth, time unveils temporary forms of inequalities, in particular social inequalities. And he invites us to think of the paradox of the longer term in this emergency situation, integrating reflection, evaluation, and education for thinking how to act now.
Merci beaucoup, Damien et Irène. J'évoquais mardi.
Thanks very much, Damien and Irene. So, at the beginning of the week, I was talking about the philosophical critics that the criticism that is used by the Anthropocene school, and of course, you are raising the same questions here by encouraging us to broaden our scope in terms of time. And of course, we should bear in mind the fact that we've inherited a lot of different approaches thanks to philosophy. Did you want to add something? Well, just to elaborate on what you were saying, that's the goal of our workshop. And what we would like to do is to offer thinking processes on different topics without necessarily getting to hands-on results. But it's very difficult to have customized solutions today, but change should be broader thanks to the scientific revolution and thanks to our podcast. Well, thank you very much for your contribution, and it's absolutely exciting to listen to what you've just said, and I'm sure that the debate that we'll have with our guests will fuel the questions that you've just raised. Well, thank you very much for the presentations that you've made again. And now, if you could please leave your seat to your senior fellow panelists. And thank you very much again. And we do hope that you'll soon be able to go back to a university physically, because we do need you for our future. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Du coup, je crois que c'est le moment de demander à Yasmine et Marc de nous rejoindre.
Now's the time for Yasmine and Marc to join us. Could you please sit to the left of the screen, Mark, please? And Yasmine, if you could please sit on my side, that'd be great. Right, so the discussion that we're going to have has been broadly opened by our younger generations. I'd like to start this discussion with Holly Jean Buck, So you should appear on screen, so you're on my right. There you are, Holly. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Hello.
C'est parfait. Alors,
Thanks so much for having me.
Merci à
I'm
vous.
going to start out by sharing a graph with you. It's a.
Alors, chère Holly, si vous me permettez.
Well, dear Holly, sorry to interrupt. I would just like to, before giving you the floor, I'd like to say a few words, if you don't mind. Is that all right for you?
OK.
Of course.
Alors, chers collègues, merci encore de votre participation. Permettez-moi.
So, dear colleagues, thank you very much for being here with us. And of course, Holly, allow me to say that your name sounds like an actress in Western movies. And so you work at the Buffalo University and you work in geoengineering on changing our policies, and you very often say that this won't be enough to mitigate the increase of the temperatures and of the 1.5 degrees that were enacted globally. So that's one of the questions that you've raised. And you also suggest the fact that it's possible to change and to affect the carbon concentration in the atmosphere thanks to by
pour vous de nous brosser en quelques minutes le tableau de ce combat immense et de
thanks to carbon pits.
La difficulté de l'exercice que nous
And
proposons.
I know that it will be a very difficult exercise for you, Holly-Jean, but if you allow me to say so, as I was saying, your name sounds like a Western movie for us, but I would love you to tell us where you come from, where you're giving the speech from, and I would like our interpreters just to pause their interpretation for a few seconds so that we can listen to your voice and listen to the few words that you're going to tell us in English.
Duquel vous vous adressez à nous ce soir.
Sure. Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm coming to you today from a rural area in western New York State. So about 7 hours drive from New York City, very close to Canada.
Merci beaucoup, cher Alizard. Alors, vous défendez, comme je l'évoquais à l'instant, vous défendez certaines politiques de géo-ingénierie.
So thank you very much. As I was saying, you defend geoengineering techniques, just like reforestation. And from what I've read from you and from what I've listened to, and basing ourselves on everything that's available about you on the internet, some areas of the world show that it's kind of desperate sometimes with very negative carbon results and carbon footprints. So are we not wrong in terms of politics and concerning the policies you focus on?
Well, a lot of my focus is on how do we remove carbon from the atmosphere, because it's very clear that we need to remove large amounts, billions of tons actually, over the course of this century. And that's very challenging because natural methods like planting forests would require quite a lot of land. And we also have industrial technologies that can capture carbon from the atmosphere. And then it has to be injected in wells to be stored underground. And those technologies are not mature at scale yet. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Merci beaucoup. J'allais vous m'adresser à vous en anglais. Du coup, je vous laisse.
Well, thank you very much. I was about to speak to you in English, but I forgot that we had interpreters. So, could you please introduce your book before I interrupted you earlier? And I'm sorry about this.
Yeah, well, my book is about the challenges of all these different techniques to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And also, I talk a bit about solar geoengineering or solar radiation management, which some people suggest could be used as an emergency measure if mitigation and carbon removal aren't implemented in time.
Merci, Oligine.
Thank you, Oligine. I think I've understood earlier that you've prepared a presentation. Is that right? I think it's quite a long presentation. So if you could please go ahead with your presentation, that'd be great.
Yeah, and
take your
I will
time.
shorten it just a couple of minutes to show some graphs, which I think can help us understand the situation that we face, if that's okay.
S'il vous plaît.
You now have the floor.
So science has spelled out what we need to do, and it can be summed up in this figure, which illustrates what it would take to curb warming to 2 degrees Celsius. So you'll notice that first, this curve of emissions starts to bend down very rapidly, starting right now. You'll also notice that by the end of the century, the world hits this point of net zero and becomes net negative. There's still some remaining emissions, actually, if you see this orange segment above the zero line, but they're compensated for by removing carbon. And by the end of the century, the world is removing a tremendous amount of carbon from the atmosphere. So if you take this figure as desirable, and in general I do, although I would prefer a smaller amount of remaining emissions and a smaller amount of negative emissions to compensate it, the next question is, what politics are necessary to realize this figure? And so the kind of society that could execute a plan like this for a centuries-long work has the capacity to plan. It also has a technological sensing capacity to know where carbon is going. So there's a huge amount of monitoring and computing and tracking behind this. And it's also not a corrupt society. People are honest about the numbers of emissions and removals. There's a few more things I want to call attention to with this graph. I mean, obviously the curve is bending sharply downward, so that means electrifying everything, retiring coal plants, outfitting industrial facilities with carbon capture and storage, carbon neutral fuels, and more. And there's many roadmaps for how to do this. The second thing that's less obvious is land. So this carbon removal and the renewable energy for the electrification will also require quite a bit of land. And the third thing, which is less well appreciated, is that a good part of this problem isn't about just carbon dioxide. CO2 is only about 65% of our emissions. So we have to reformulate agriculture, reduce methane emissions in agriculture and the greenhouse gases from fertilizer as well. So you need a politics which can enable land use change, shifts in agricultural production, this massive electrification effort. And this implies transforming rural areas for the benefit of urban ones. So that informs the kind of politics we might need. Right now, we already have some conflicts in rural areas because of the impact of wind and solar infrastructure. At least in the US, some of these projects are very contested. And we've only barely gotten started on the scale of what we will need. I wanted to make a further point about how some people might interpret this graph and what it recommends. They might say we need to restrict consumption dramatically. The crisis demands it. However, doing so via individual consumer choices, I think will not work. Mandating behavioral change or restrictions that individuals feel won't work. And I think we know this from our experiences during the past year. Popular anger erupted at elites around lockdown measures from the pandemic, not simply because of the idea of restrictions, but because many elites were seen flouting these restrictions eating at fancy restaurants or otherwise doing things that indicated that the restrictions were not for them. They were only for common folk. And I think that any sort of restrictions relating to climate will produce a worse situation, if not violence. And so already we have these kind of commentators fearing a climate lockdown or suggesting that pandemic restrictions are just kind of a warm-up for climate lockdowns. They hear climate emergency, which is a phrase that many of us are using, but then they think, oh, we know how this emergency goes because of the lockdowns. So I think we need to reject this type of politics and eliminate this emergency rhetoric, actually. Even though the situation is very urgent, it can be urgent without being an emergency, because the temporality of the problem we're facing is for the rest of our lifetimes, for the rest of the century. So it demands a different sort of politics. And I'm optimistic, actually, that we can get rural people on board with clean energy. There's actually good data that we have that people might support these things. And so I wanted to show you some polling from the States, in part because the book by Mark also discusses the situation in the States a bit. And actually, people are quite positive on many different things relating to climate and energy policies. So the majority of people support regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. They support renewable energy, and there's room there to build on. And I also think that we need to focus our attention on companies, not on individuals. So this graph I showed earlier focuses on emissions, as does most of climate policy. The Paris Agreement recommends a balance of sources and sinks. Net zero targets are also focused on emissions. But these policies are silent on the question of fossil fuel production. So we need to start focusing on regulating companies instead of individuals. And I think that a consensus between left and right on that is possible today because there's actually a lot of anger around big companies, in particular relating to the tech sector. Both left and right agree on the need to rein in big technology. They have concerns about monopolization in sectors like pharmaceuticals and agriculture. So there's room for a politics that's anti-monopolist. And this isn't just about business, it's also about the climate. And so I think two more things for this politics, and then I'll wrap up. We need to articulate material.
Take your time. That's perfect.
We need to articulate material benefits and policies for people in rural areas. It's very basic. And third, we can only do any of this by resisting this urge to demonize people who are rural voters or Trump voters. We can't just reject all of these people as deplorables, which is an insult that they've taken on as kind of a slogan here in the US. We have to build alliances with people that we might not agree with them on anything else, but the situation calls for it. And I'll suggest one more hopeful thing, I think. At the beginning of this discussion about a Green New Deal, you can see when they did this polling in 2019, the end of 2018, 57% of Republicans supported a Green New Deal. This was before they heard on Fox News that a Green Deal was something belonging to the other side. They actually like many of the policies in it. They just became familiar with the branding by these conservative media outlets, and then they came to reject it. But the basic ideas there, if they are unbundled from the Green New Deal, are supportable. So I know that this sounds like a lot of compromise, But I think that in the US, our new administration is going to be well poised to act on many of these clean energy policies. And so we need a politics of alliance with rural workers against big corporations, and that has demonstrated public benefits in rural areas and is pro-technology. And I think that we're a good part of the way there. If we fail at doing this, it won't just be because of the people on the right. It will actually also be because socially mediated critics on the left made deplorable caricatures of the other people in the country and mocked them and shamed them and gave them more food for their conspiracy theories. It will be of our own doing. So let's avoid that kind of politics. Let's avoid any suggestion of climate emergency that could be read as leading to climate lockdowns, and build these uncomfortable temporary alliances to get some of this clean energy infrastructure built. Thanks. That's my thoughts on the new politics for the climate.
Merci beaucoup, Holly Jean.
Thanks a lot, Holly Jean. And thank you for keeping to the time that you could use for your introduction. So I want to remember from your presentation a kind of optimism on a possible consensus for broader solutions, bringing together a large part of the population, also focus points on which you draw our attention, in particular a point that is very important, that sums up the common point of the situation of the USA and our country, the tension on climate policies and the position of rural areas and urban areas regarding these policies. And another point you have highlighted is the issue of temporality. And I've seen that your presentation caught the attention of our guests here in the studio, the issue of emergency and the balance we have to strike between a quick action and the idea of bringing together the larger part of our population. So I suggest now we give the floor to our second guest. I suggest we start with Marc Alizard. He's just published a book. So I can imagine that he is eager to share with us the content of this book. You're a writer, you're a philosopher, you've written many different essays, and you are interested in very different subjects, fields. You've written about cryptocurrency. You also published a book called Crypto Communism. So you have a wide range of interests, and this month you have just published a book called the Coup d'État Climatique. And in the book, you show the constant and sometimes cynical drift of our political leaders, and you engage people to reclaim power to start the revolution of public action. So I invite you to share with us the ideas you have developed in your book. I'm sorry I haven't prepared a presentation as well developed as Holly's. Actually, my book was published a year ago, just before the lockdown, and I think that nowadays situation, the pandemics, is also interesting. Actually, it's added other arguments to my viewpoint, the politicization of phenomena. So the climate coup, before getting a vivid demonstration of this coup with the pandemics. And actually that was something we couldn't have imagined, that science could be read through political lenses. When we speak about climate, we speak about humankind, we speak about emergency, broad concepts that are common to everyone on the planet. Whereas, and we've seen that through the COVID crisis, any statement can be faced with its contradiction, with divisions, class divisions, a geographical division, conflict of interest. And as a consequence, we don't react the same way faced with these issues. So my point in the book was that we need a new political strategy in order to face a new kind of reality, a climate reality. And the point was that climate skepticism was higher in its relationship with people. For a long time, people used to say, it doesn't exist, you are liars. Then people started saying, it exists, but it's not an issue. And by the way, people using geoengineering to prove that it exists, but it's not a big deal because we've got the technology to fight against it. But of course, sometimes technology has not scaled up. And while I was writing the book after the wildfires happening on Earth, in Brazil, in Australia, a little bit later, in California, of course, I was fascinated. Oh, by the way, wildfires also in Siberia, and that have never been put out, and that are bigger than the ones I've already mentioned. And the climate skepticism was even higher in denying reality, because now they just say, we don't care. So now they say, it exists. It's dangerous. Who cares? So how could we raise awareness among people? And it's interesting because when designing our strategies to fight against climate skepticism and to fight against climate change, we've always thought of informing people, counting on the fact that people are not stupid and they will understand. But as a matter of fact, the situation is much more difficult than that, because informed people can answer, I'm not worried. And even some people say, I'm happy about it. Let's see Donald Trump, for instance. As a president at the beginning of the pandemics, he showed that he wasn't in control of the pandemics, and it's a bit sad because a president is supposed to be a hero. And the other point also is that I think it was on CNN, a report saying that COVID affected only colored, poor people. Literally. And suddenly, Trump takes the floor and says, COVID is not his business anymore, and that we won't stop economy for the sake of saving such people. And then science starts being political. So we design a policy in order to have group immunity, and then the weaker can disappear. And this is Darwinism. Trump is not a climate skeptic because he's got insurances in order to fight against climate change. That's on the one hand, but on the other hand, on Twitter, he wrote to people in New York, I won't build a wall around New York, so get ready to swim. Because New York is also the Western elite that didn't vote for him. So at the end of the day, climate change is not our business. It's the business of our enemies, the Western elite, the shithole countries. So that was the starting point of my reflection. So that is to say, we have to be able to understand, also following Naomi Klein's logics, that we're not all equal and we don't have the same mindset regarding climate change. And the second part of my book was dedicated on how we can fight against that, keeping in mind that our first intent was to use information, and I had demonstrated that despite information, informed people decided to go on not caring. In order to highlight what you have developed, I will quote the title of chapter 3 of your book, Carbofascism. Through this title, you underline this increasing violent politicization of the fight, of the drift of climate policies. In the second part of the book, you suggest ways of challenging this way of seeing climate change. Well, I'm not the one who coined carbofascism. The carbofascism defines the fact that liberal states, and it's a euphemism, can be interested by catastrophe. The example we can give is that, for instance, in South Africa, some areas are just deprived of water for a few months a year, and there is no organization of a self-managed community. No, there's tanks of water, and that's it. So a few regimes would like to go on using this kind of policy. And when they see migrant refugees, climate refugees, they don't really care. So the second part of the book says that we should draw our inspiration from Trotsky and the way he decided to fight against the coming of fascism at his time. And regarding today, what we can learn from one of the few social movements that have been successful act up. Because I think that intellectually, politically, they were very strong, applying the Trotsky's three principles: creation of a common front, that is the opposite of consensus, for the record, what we're trying to do. A common front is the crystallization of the enemy. The enemy is not only the one who doesn't care about my cause, my enemy wants to kill me. This is what I call crystallization. And maybe I disagree with Holly, because maybe I'm not sure we can be bipartisan with our enemies. Second principle, the issue of technology. I think we should develop a technology as powerful as our enemies. And thirdly, hope, an ideology that allows us to think the world of the future and not fixing today's world. And I think ACT UP had the three principles, because ACT UP saw the death of a whole genocide of a whole population. Political leaders said the only answer they could come up with was promoting condoms. ACT UP said it's not enough, because there is consensus about the fact that AIDS is a deathly disease, but political leaders know that the most affected people are gay people, poor people, colored people. So ACT UP decided to stop euphemism. It's not enough to say protect yourself. Gay people are affected, and ACT UP said, if you don't help us, you kill us. And then they started throwing blood at political leaders, and then things changed. Money was invested. There was a new public policy, health policy. And then the other point is technology. We use labs, we use science, and ACT UP activists didn't say, stop fucking. They said, no. Okay, use condoms. I'm sorry, I'm speeding up, I'm getting passionate, and I know. It's great to see that you're passionate, that you're full of will to go on explaining, but my role here is to have a look at the clock. Okay, so let me conclude, please. So the issue of technology, so as to strike an alliance that Holly has suggested, and I think her book is great, really. Many intellectuals dare to enter this proposal. So I think she's really brave, because we don't want to be tomorrow in a situation where we are just reactive and not proactive. So we have to speak about what we can hear, what we want. And by the way, Holly's book can be read as a novel. In sub-chapters, she speaks about how we could live in a different climate. And in a book by Tim Robinson, The Ministry of the Future, and maybe Holly has read the book, you see what it is to live in a society where you die from heat. And the Ministry of the Future is a democratic council in charge of organizing nations through technology that can help people survive the heat. So this is the technical point. And thirdly, the issue of hope. And there, with a more philosophical approach, we get back to the Anthropocene. Is Anthropocene a stone in our shoe, and the point is to go back to the time when humankind didn't have any impact on the environment? Or is it an opportunity, something we could associate with what is called terraforming? But maybe we can learn from that. Anyway, it's a turning point that can be compared with the Stone Age, or also the farming revolution. Can we be up to the challenge? And can we claim that we have a future, that we can invent our future, that time will not stop? So can we enter the future from our present? So these three elements. In order to finish up with my ACT UP metaphor, ACT UP is used to saying this is not only our fight, it's also a fight to acknowledge all the different genders, not only our sexuality. It's not a community fight, it's a fight for all the people. For all these reasons, I think that faced with this new reality, our enemies' reality and the climate and political reality, this new strategy, as far as I'm concerned, should be a climate policy.
Thank you so much, Marc, for these enlightening words. So you've talked about the rise of thinking and the notion of time on which you're concluding your book. This is one of the red threads throughout your book and your books. And you've talked about this disagreement, this fine line that can and I mean, in terms of points of view, you probably disagree with Holly, and that's what you said, concerning the use of politics in the actions that we need. And we can see that finding consensus and trust and the feeling of emergency and the notion that people can disagree, and because of conflict of interests, well, we can see that there are two options on which we need to we'll need to get back to. And so, focusing on political action takes us to the third part of our discussion with Yasmine Bouaga, who changed her career path a few months ago, because you were elected last July as the mayor of the 1st district of Lyon, and also at Lyon Metropole, which is an association of town halls for Greater Lyon. And so this Greater Lyon is a legal creation, and it's a unique creation in France that allows all the territories around Lyon in the suburbs together in one and only local government with a direct political vote, and with incredible political means that represent more than 4 billion euros. So it's one of the biggest association of municipalities in France, and so this group is bigger than the Rhône-Alpes-Auvergne region. Well, this is technically very French. And so here we're competing in terms of budget with the Paris region. And so you got that very good result by defending ecology, and so you now hold the levers for action, and you're deeply committed in this fight to make our societies change and adapt to climate change. So now, give you the floor, Yasmine. So what's your take on this fight? Well, thank you very much. I'd like to give probably a more humble context. I'm just an advisor here in this city with humble resources. If we compare to companies like Apple, Total. So I'd like to give you my approach to this fight for climate. And so the ecological crisis we're facing is multifaceted because our resources are vanishing and biodiversity is slowly dying, and so there are several consequences on our lives as human beings and as a society. And so politicians have to live up to these various challenges and probably in a more humble way than what was done in the past. So how can we face this in a democratic way? And that's a very complicated question that you sent me earlier before starting this session. And at many respects, democracy can be a hurdle when taking unpopular measures, questioning our individual comfort. And of course, you've probably heard of the Nutella tax and also the carbon tax. So of course, the question of the acceptability of measures is something important. And so if we want to reduce our carbon footprint, we should not reject more CO2 in the atmosphere than carbon sinks can absorb. And if we want to stick to the Paris Accord, for instance, we need to reduce our meat consumption, reduce how many times we take a plane per year, for instance, so change the way we go on holiday, buy less iPhones, for instance. So this could be perceived as a punishment for people, and it's probably a top-to-bottom approach. And people would feel punished because of these measures. And for instance, the Yellow Vests movement in France, Gilets jaunes, reflected the fact that people were trying to fight for their rights, and they perceived it as an attack to their rights, as something that attacked their rights. And this environmental argument was labeled as hypocritical and something protecting large companies. And of course, the people who would take the roundabouts in France would talk about it. And what we saw was the synergy between these movements and the climate marches, and it did show that it was necessary to find synergies in terms of environment and also with social movements by recreating more equal societies or fairer societies, more fair. And of course, humble and ordinary people get more and more taxes, and it's a burden for them in terms of living standards. And so that's where the citizen convention emerged. So we can get back to this notion of transformation, because citizens are well informed and they can offer ambitious and brave measures for the common interest. So this convention consisted of 150 people in its whole diversity in terms of generations, origins, and geographical origins too. So the objective of the reduction was minus 40% in 2030 for carbon emissions. And the goal was to advocate for social justice. And so this convention, or these think tanks, as we could call them, wanted to remain independent in their judgment on consuming, producing, working, getting a house, and moving around. And so they formulated 140 proposals. Well, these proposals were then destroyed by the bill that was presented by the government, and it does not reflect the objectives that were created by citizens. And we have seen the weight of lobbies, and for instance, concerning SUVs, there was a law that was proposed and then it was cancelled, and also on the agricultural policy. And so that's why a lot of citizens want to commit at local level, and that's my case here in Lyon as new elected officials. We didn't have any experience, political experience, and we all had a job that we liked in the past, but we were strongly worried about our future. And for instance, in Lyon, all these new buildings in La Part-Dieu and a new highway, all this goes against our stances. And so we succeeded in the last elections, and so now we are off to work, and we've been off to work for 6 months. So I'm just going to show you what we are doing right now. It's not to promote our work, but just to show you what we can do against this environmental crisis. But as I was saying, it's really humble, and we're not, dealing with geoengineering, and it's not our approach. And that's why I'm highlighting this, so that we can discuss these points later on. So I'm not financially independent in the first district, but we're all part of the ecologist majority, but we all have budgets, of course, and the fact of managing water and water use at global level and public level will ensure a fair distribution. And it's really important because we know that the Rhone River flow will reduce in the upcoming years. And zero carbon means of transportation are also important, and it's shown that a lot of people who live less than 1 kilometer from where they work drive to work. And so a lot of people recommend, the World Health Organization encourages to walk more and more. And, with bike lanes, for instance, or just just walking to work is something that is really important, and there are a lot of green projects reintroducing vegetation inside the city can encourage people to do this. And third, social housing. Why is this important? Well, because we want to make sure that these new buildings are not dedicated to speculative investments, but social housing. So we need to go even further with taxes on the real estate market, for instance. Another measure would be to reduce our meat consumption and offer 2 vegetarian meals a week, and this will reduce our carbon footprint. And deforestation also, because breeding cattle requires cutting down trees in Brazil, for instance, in the Amazonian forest. And so, of course, it's extremely related to deforestation. And third, we can see that public orders are a powerful lever to support our local economies and to build more sustainable policies, and so to create a bond between rural and urban territories. This is absolutely crucial.
Et un cinquième point, le cinquième point rapidement, et ça me paraît très important, c'est favoriser la nature en ville. Alors c'est pas
one last point, and I think it's really important, is to reintroduce nature inside the city, because sometimes we're disconnected from reality. And living in a concrete jungle is something very difficult. And of course, if we reconnect with nature, we'll probably understand how these technologies can destroy nature. Simply, creating a garden in the building yard, for instance. This will help us educate the general public, and will reconnect with nature around us. Sometimes it's quite striking to see that people identify carb wrens and cannot recognize the bird that's flying in front of them. So sometimes we are just locked up, and we are prisoners of this economic model we're in that made us believe that we could improve and make progress infinitely. And just to wrap up on this point, as an elected official, I consider myself as a link in this chain with our citizens, and it's a crucial action that I'm taking at my level in the democratic apparatus. We need to reconnect power to this economic environmental priority at local, national, and international level. And so these mitigation tools will then help us implement the measures that will take us to an environmental transition for a common world. Well, thank you very much for this presentation that will probably fuel our discussion. And you're talking about scales here. You're talking about this very specifically French topic, you know, with the think tanks here in France. I don't know if you understood that point, Halogene, concerning environmental and political issues, and I've also understood your very smart and elegant answer, saying that, you know, 4 billion euros, this is a big figure, but it's really humble if we compare this to companies like Apple or Total. And I totally understand what you're saying, and you're being really cautious here in order to debate and discuss these questions. But despite the fact that you're being really cautious, I'd like to hear you on the discussion that has started between our two thinkers here, one here with us in Lyon and Holly, and they disagree on some points. So I'd like to understand your reaction, and I'd like you to give us your take on this. In order for us to help citizens. So that was the suggestion that Halogene made, or shall we, on the contrary, consider that the oppositions between people in our society today have become so violent and become sometimes even fascist oppositions that we need to choose more radical options.
Quite a challenging question. It's not the same answer whether you are campaigning for a political position or you are in this political position. So you also have to think of the political program you've been elected for. So the measures you set up are not always made of consensus. We act taking into account the collective interest, but that has nothing to do with consensus. I also understand that it's a tricky question, but today Marx's suggestion suggests showing that if we oppose if you violently oppose redesigning policies, you have to advocate for action. Is it going too far?
Je dirais pas que c'est exagéré, puisque mais là, par exemple, au niveau de la métropole de Lyon,
for the greater Lyon, the context is not as conflictual as when you are faced with someone like Trump or Bolsonaro. Some measures can trigger discontent. For instance, the low-emission policy limiting access to the urban area for polluting vehicles can trigger discontent, but the point is not to stigmatize people owning pollutant vehicles, but to accompany them into changing the way they move around, or encouraging them to buy less polluting vehicles. So we want to show that we work for the common world and for the sake of everyone. So we've just heard the viewpoint of a field player, and we've understood that she has to manage opposed demands. But to follow up what Mark said, from a global geopolitical viewpoint, Holly, what you tell us in your brilliant work, what is your stance on this issue? Do you want to object to Mark's arguments?
I mean, I don't want to totally object because I was offered a really great English translation of this work, and I think that Mark and I are concerned about many of the same things. I think that we have to remember that the enemy is the capitalist who is appropriating some value from our labor, right? So the enemies are these big corporations, whether that's Exxon or Amazon, not each other. And it's been very clever how the elites have used these platforms to divide us and make ourselves focus on common people as the enemy, because then we can never come together to mount a challenge or an attack on their dominance. So when I say consensus, I'm thinking about a consensus with the people in rural areas. I think that because I'm a rural sociologist, so in my research, I'm frequently talking to people in these places, and that's steered my thinking towards how can we find common cause with them against these other enemies. So that's the kind of consensus I'm thinking about, really.
Mais la thèse que
thesis, Mark's thesis of hardening climate skeptics, opposing more and more violently. We've spoken of Jean-Baptiste Fresseau, who speaks about carbofascism. Is it an analysis perspective that appeals to you, or do you think that we are making a cliché of the situation, and that hides the possibility of building up such a consensus?
I think it's a reasonable thing to be concerned about. I think that right now we have a media ecology where a small group of people can claim a very large discursive power. And so right now we are at a moment where these people are a small number of people, but that could change in the future. So I think it's very important to be wary of it and think about how to prevent that from growing.
Marc, vous avez regardé, j'imagine, l'actualité.
Mark, I can imagine that you followed the news in the USA, in particular what Holly has said, in particular the beginning of the Biden administration. What is your opinion about the possible future and also the Red Cross that we could see in Holly's presentation? Yes, interesting, but she's also shown a graphic that was terrifying, and the Republican in favor of the Green New Deal, whereas it was a Democrat measure, dropping the figure to 32. The Republican Party was more fragile after the capital event, so they should work on the tumor in order to build again this old bipartisan tradition in the USA. But I think that this parenthesis has ended and the Republicans have decided to support Trump until the end, besides the 74 million people who have voted for Trump. That is more than the people who voted for him at the beginning for his first presidential mandate. So there's no room for optimism. And I think that the Biden administration will be faced with a wall, a closed door, so the only solution is to declare the climate emergency, choosing what presidents can do when there's an emergency, governing through executive orders, as we've seen in the past when they wanted to enter war. But now war would be against the destruction of our planet. So will we have a president saying that this is outside of the parliamentary debate and it's the president's prerogative to start war in order to electrify the world, to organize techniques for capturing carbon? I don't know. Any surprise is possible, but he's used to power. He's the most experiment person at the White House for a long time. He knows what power is. So I could be optimistic regarding his ability to invent solutions for this combat. That being said, I definitely agree with Holly and with you with the need of setting up an alliance with rural territories, but we're not there yet. There is much work to do. And it could be a political key for the whole country. So also the other question is, can we strike an alliance with white supremacists who are thinking of accompanying the destruction of Earth? So can we be allies with people who, because of the economic crisis that we've been through for 30 years, people who now live in nihilism? I could read a survey, quite terrifying, by the way, asking, do you think that the only way to get out of the current situation is to destroy all the institutions, to burn them to the ground, as it was put in English? And 64% of US citizens said, yes, we should burn it down. So saving our planet doesn't have meaning for such people. I think we've reached such a level of despair and lack of confidence in the elite, in the governments, in the future, that for people, sometimes it's better not to have anything than to try and have something. So I think the issue of hope is crucial there. We can only have hope if we tell people that something is awaiting, and not less but more. And it's challenging for ecologists to say that there will be more than less awaiting. There will be something more. In just a moment, I'll ask Holly to tell us in a few words what's happening in the USA, seen from France. And Yasmine, you will have a word now. And we have 10 minutes left until the end of our debate. There is also this territory gap. First of all, I wanted to react to Mark's comment. I think there is room for debate I read your essay with much interest, the way you can mobilize in a real fight against carbon fascism, giving hope through technology. And it was also interesting to read Holly's work. She's very honest when she tells the way that research is developing ways for capturing carbon. These geoengineering approaches through the capture of carbon and the also intervention on the stratosphere in order to limit the sun rays. But this also goes hand in hand with major governance and technical issues, because these solutions have still to be adapted to such scale. So, as far as I'm concerned, my political stance is to work on reducing emissions. And as you've said, Mark, the challenge of envisaging such reduction without punishing people. And many of the best things in life don't destroy the living and can be without any carbon emissions. So there is something to develop around imaginary and happiness. Holly, do you want to react after listening to our perspective, our French perspective about the recent evolution of US politics and the possible pessimistic analysis of the situation in the USA?
Well, I would say that I'm not sure what the prescription is, if that's the case, because executive action, we've seen, maybe you've read about it in the press this week, an executive order from President Biden, which probably does most of what he could reasonably do at this point with executive orders. So a moratorium on drilling in federal lands, announcement of many different types of programs around procurement for clean energy vehicles, et cetera. Quite a good order given the circumstances, but I'm not sure what more is possible right now. One thing I think is that we're past the point where the US is at the center of climate action. So obviously a much more multipolar world. And I'm optimistic that the signals coming from the US and via investors about the direction of things are something to build international policy and collaborations around. I'm not super optimistic, but I'm moderately optimistic compared to where we were a couple of months ago.
Merci. Alors, je suggérais que...
Thanks a lot. So my suggestion was to have a debate on the issue you've spoken about, the gap between rural and urban territories. I think the situation of France and the USA are quite alike. In the framework of the US presidential election, I've seen maps with the results county by county, and I saw that almost the whole territory was red in the USA. When we see the results, and When we think of local elections in France last July, we could see phenomena quite similar to the ones in the USA, with the big cities being engaged into ecology and progressism, might be Democrat if you want, and territories around cities or rural territories with a high percentage of abstention, and maybe a trend reminding us of the Gilets jaunes. I don't know if you heard about what happened last year. Apparently, yes. So these are echoes to this rural-urban area gap. So maybe you, Yasmin, how can we hope, and you suggested that before, how can we hope having ambitious policies in urban areas without dividing more the country than it is today, in particular thinking of peri-urban or rural areas? Well, first of all, I think we should acknowledge the interconnection and to encourage these interconnection. 90% of the farming production is exported beyond the Greater Lyon, and in Lyon itself, we will consume products coming from Spain or beyond. This is something that is a pure nonsense. I mean, I cannot understand that. And this also intensifies the gap. So when we speak about food at school, reducing meat, and having more organic and local food equals encouraging, supporting local farming and virtuous farming, because public money would be invested in such practices, helping the farming sector to be sustainable without exhausting resources. So this is really practical. On a daily basis, we can have a new kind of interaction that has been deepened with the international relationship of the Greater Lyon with other countries. Holly, maybe we don't have much time left. Would you like to say something about the potential ability of the geoengineering science capacity in limiting the gap between rural and urban areas?
Well, there's a lot that rural areas could do to help with carbon removal. And the question is, will that be designed in a way that actually benefits them or feels extractive? So, for example, one thing the new administration will do, which is very popular, is to help farmers farm in a way that stores more carbon in the soil. So that's great. That's a very basic step. But then we also have to think about geological carbon capture and storage. Will those projects be designed in a way where there's financial flows to these communities so that everybody in the community sees a benefit, or only for some specific landowners? Will it feel like a waste disposal project, or will it be seen as new energy infrastructure that benefits the whole community? I don't know. These are the choices that we'll face in the next couple of years. And I hope that we can all think about ways to maximize the benefit to communities.
Merci beaucoup, Marc. C'est à vous que revient le mot de la conclusion.
And Marc, the last word is for you, the revolutionary writer, what do you think of the gap between rural and urban areas from your perspective? I think it's a crucial key, both, as I said, for political victory for ecologist parties. It's a new alliance, a new form of alliance with rural areas, and at the same time, I think ecologists are now in such a position to offer a new social contract, unifying the rural and the urban people. I live in the countryside, and there is a deep ecological understanding, and at the same time, the feeling of being left behind. So I think that if the ecologists can get out of the cities in order to extend their hand to the rural areas, and realizing that the peri-urban cities and the rural cities can also be green, that would give much hope. I think it's the key. So will the ecologists be able to get out of the cities? That's the final question as a conclusion of this debate. We will keep it in mind, thinking also of time, the issue of time we started the debate with, thanks to the younger generation who have worked for the whole week on this issue. In the framework of the Festival of Anthropocene, I want to thank the three of you very deeply, warmly, for accepting this debate. I think that we all have different perspectives. I want to thank Jasmine. I want to thank our friend Holly from the USA to have been with us, although remotely, but it was a real pleasure to have you here. So you still have, I hope, a nice Saturday to enjoy. We wish good luck to the Biden administration, and keeping in mind all the new perspectives we have to get mobilized for the coming political rendezvous.